A starving girl broke into a stranger's kitchen one snowy night, hoping to steal a single loaf of bread before dawn. Just a small act of desperation, nothing more. What she didn't know, the man who caught her was the richest, loneliest duke in all of England, and he hadn't tasted a single bite of food in 4 long years. The bread was still warm when the candle lifted behind her. Leora Bennet stood frozen with her fingers buried in a half loaf of brown bread, snow melting from her boots onto the kitchen flagstones. She did not turn. She did not breathe. She only listened to the heavy tread of someone crossing the room behind her, and the small, awful sound of a key turning in the back door. "Thief," said the voice. It belonged to a man, old and tired and certain. She did not run. There was nowhere to run to. The snowstorm had been driving across the Yorkshire moors for 2 days, and the windows of Blackthorn Estate had glowed in the dark, like the only fires left in England. Leora had walked 9 miles through that snow with her grandmother's shawl about her shoulders and nothing in her stomach. If she ran now, she would die before morning. A second servant came in, then a third. They took her by both arms without ceremony. The bread fell from her hand and rolled under the long oak table. "To the master, then," said the old man. "He'll decide what's to be done with her." Leora had heard of Duke Cedric Ashcombe the way most folk in the north heard of him, in whispers passed across market stalls and in doorways. They said he had been poisoned years ago at a great dinner in London, and that whatever the poison had been, it had taken something from him that could not be returned. Some said his taste, some said his soul. They all agreed in the end that he was a cold man now, and a cruel one, and not to be trusted with the lives of the small folk. She had believed enough of it to be afraid. The servants marched her down a stone corridor lined with portraits in heavy gilt frames. Painted Ashcombes stared down at her with the same long jaw and the same pale eyes. At the end of the corridor stood 2 carved doors, and behind those doors was the dining hall. It was a long room lit by tall candles in iron stands, the walls hung with dark green drapery, and the head of an enormous stag mounted above the hearth. At the far end of an oak table that could have seated 20 sat one man, alone, with a plate of cold meat untouched before him. He wore a black wool coat and a high white cravat. His hair was the color of damp ash. He did not look up when she was dragged in. "Your Grace," said the old butler, "we have a girl in the kitchen, stealing." The Duke set down his fork. Only then did he look at her. His eyes were empty, the way a pond is empty in February when nothing moves inside it. "How old?" he said. 19, Your Grace." "Name?" "Leora Bennet." "Bennet." He turned the name over with no expression. "From where?" "Whitby, sir. My father was a fisherman. He drowned in October. My mother went of fever in the same week. I came north looking for work." "And finding none, you broke into my kitchen?" "Yes, Your Grace." He looked at her a moment longer. Then he said quietly, "There is a workhouse in Halifax. They will take her in the morning. Lock her in the cellar tonight." The servants moved to pull her back. She had not meant to speak. She had meant to go quietly, the way her grandmother had taught her to go through hard rooms. But the cellar of a great house in winter was a slow way to die, and the workhouse a faster one, and something inside her chest broke loose. "If Your Grace permits me to stay," she said, "I shall cook for you." The room went still. The Duke's eyes did not change, but the corner of his mouth lifted in something that was almost a smile. "You shall cook for me," he repeated. "Yes, Your Grace." "A vagrant girl, half-starved, with snow in her hair, shall cook for the Duke of Ashcombe." "Yes, Your Grace." He was amused now, in a thin, unkind way. He waved his hand at the butler. "Then let her try. Send her to the kitchen. Give her whatever scraps remain. If she serves me a supper I can eat, she may keep her head. If she serves me anything less, send her to Halifax at dawn." She was set loose in the great kitchen with one tallow candle and the bones of yesterday's beef. She worked the way her grandmother had taught her on the cliffs above Whitby. Patient hands, no waste. She browned the beef bones in their own fat. She found half an onion and a bruised carrot in a basket by the door. She built a dark gravy from the drippings and a last splash of porter from a forgotten bottle on the shelf. She baked a small loaf of brown bread in the embers. She did not hurry. She did not pray. She watched the kitchen door, and she waited. An hour later, she carried a plain wooden tray into the dining hall and set a bowl of stew in front of the Duke. He looked at it without interest. He lifted the spoon. He tasted it. For the first time since the night they had carried him out of that London townhouse 4 years ago, Duke Cedric Ashcombe tasted something. It was faint, a whisper of salt, a thread of onion, the warmth of meat upon his tongue. But it was real, and it moved through him like the first crack in a frozen river. He did not speak for a long while. The candles burned, the wind worked at the windows. The servants stood with their eyes lowered to the boards. By the great stone hearth, half hidden in the shadow of the chimney breast, Dr. Edmund Malvern lowered the glass of brandy he had been holding to his lips. His face had gone the color of tallow. He looked at the bowl on the Duke's table, the way a man looks at a loaded pistol set down on a child's bed. The Duke laid the spoon aside. "The girl remains," he said. The fortnight that followed felt like waking inside another woman's life. They gave Leora a narrow chamber above the scullery, a coarse gray gown with a white apron, and a pair of leather boots that pinched at the heel. By dawn, she was at the long kitchen table, scrubbing copper pans with sand and lemon, shaping loaves, plucking grouse the gamekeeper brought in across his shoulder. By dusk, she was cooking the Duke's supper alone. Blackthorn was the strangest house she had ever set foot in. The black lacquered carriages in the courtyard stood under canvas 9 days out of 10. Visitors came rarely. The corridors ran long and cold, lit by tallow candles in iron sconces, and the portraits above the staircase watched every passing footstep. Mrs. Whitmore, the housekeeper, moved through the rooms in a black bombazine gown with a bunch of keys at her waist, and she rarely raised her voice above a whisper. The maids did the same. The whole house seemed to be holding its breath. Yet each evening, when Leora carried in a covered dish, a pigeon pie one night, a thick mutton broth the next, a plate of roast parsnips and herring on the third, something in the Duke's face shifted by a small degree. On the fourth night, he ate a bowl of barley and leek soup with the seriousness of a man reading scripture. He set down the spoon and looked at her for a long moment. "Where did you learn this?" he said. "From my grandmother, Your Grace. She kept house for a vicar's widow in Robin Hood's Bay. She had a book of receipts she copied from her own grandmother." "You have it still?" "I have it in my trunk." He nodded once and said nothing more. By the end of the first week, she understood that something had altered in him. He still spoke in the same dry, level voice, and still spent his evenings in the locked study at the end of the east wing. But she had seen him pause at the breakfast-room window for a full minute, watching a thrush on the holly bush, and once she had heard him laugh, briefly, at a remark from the stable-master. Twice she found him standing before a small portrait at the foot of the stairs, a fair-haired woman in a pearl necklace, painted in the manner of 20 years past. He stood there as a man stands at a grave. "The late Duchess Ashcombe," the undermaid whispered, "died of fever when His Grace was a young man." Other matters troubled her. Dr. Malvern came to the manor 3 afternoons in the week. He was a soft, neat man of about 50, with thin, sandy hair and a black leather case that he carried with both hands as though it contained something living. When he passed through the kitchens, the scullery maids pressed themselves against the wall. The boot boy crossed himself. None of them spoke ill of the Duke, who had been hard with them once and was now gentler than they could remember. They were frightened of the physician. After Malvern's visits, the Duke took a small glass of dark brown tincture from a green vial on the doctor's instruction. Within the hour, he would be in his chair, with his hand pressed to his temple, the curtains drawn. Leora, bringing up a posset of warm milk one such evening, found him gray about the mouth, his eyes shut, his breath shallow. "It passes," he said, without opening his eyes. "It always passes." She did not believe him. On the 9th day, she had cause to go to the still room behind the laundry, where the physician kept his supplies under lock. The door was ajar by a finger's width. She only looked in. 3 tall presses stood within, fitted with new brass locks, and along the upper shelf sat a row of stoppered jars labeled in a clerk's hand. She read 2 before she heard a step in the passage. Black hellebore, henbane dried. Neither had business in a gentleman's medicine cabinet. She walked away as though she had seen nothing. That evening, the old butler, his name was Mr. Hargrove, and he had served the family 40 years, lingered after the others had gone to bed. He stood with his hands folded behind his back, watching the embers. "You are a sensible girl, Bennet," he said at last. "I try to be, sir." "Then mind me. His Grace was not the same man after London. The gentleman who travelled down to Westminster that summer was one man. The gentleman who came home was another." He drew a slow breath. "Cook plainly for him, and do not take any cordial offered to you in this house, however kindly the offer is made." He left her with that. She lay awake until the small hours, listening to the wind in the chimney. When at last she slept, she did not sleep deeply. Something woke her near 3 o'clock, a faint, wrong sound, the soft scrape of a boot on stone somewhere below. She came down the back stairs in her stockinged feet. The kitchen was dark, but the embers in the great hearth glowed red, and by their light she saw the iron door of the bread oven standing open. A small fire had been freshly fed inside it. Curled black against the brick, crisping into nothing, were 3 torn pages of her grandmother's hand. The garden door stood open to the snow. Whoever had been there was gone. She knelt and lifted out what she could save. 3 pages had already gone to ash. The 4th had been spared by chance, its corner blackened, its center still legible. A receipt for a winter cordial of nettle, vervain, and crushed rowanberry, written in her grandmother's careful, looping hand. Beneath the receipt, drawn in the same ink, was a small symbol she had seen all her childhood and never thought to ask about. A black sun, ringed by 7 points. Word came from London on the morning of the 12th day. A rider in muddy boots and a Whitehall livery handed Mrs. Whitmore a heavy paper sealed in red wax. The Duke read it standing at his library window with his back to the room. When he turned again, he was no longer the man who had walked through breakfast. "We leave for London on Thursday," he told the housekeeper. "Parliament sits on the 15th. There are matters I have neglected too long." Then, without raising his voice, he added, "Bennet travels with us. She will see to my private table." Mrs. Whitmore did not argue, though her mouth thinned. Dr. Malvern, writing at the side table, set down his pen with great care. They left at dawn 3 days later, in 2 black traveling carriages, with a wagon for trunks following behind. Leora rode in the second carriage with the lady's maid and a footman called Tom, who shared an apple with her on the first morning and had nothing to say thereafter. The roads south through the Vale of York were ribboned with frozen mud, and at every coaching inn, the Black Bull at Doncaster, the Angel at Grantham, the George at Stamford, they ate boiled mutton beside pedlars and corn merchants and slept 3 to a bed beneath horse blankets that smelt of tallow. They reached London on the 5th night, the carriages coming down through Highgate with the lamps lit. She had never seen anything like it. Smoke from 100,000 chimneys hung at the height of a man's head, yellow and sour, so that the gas lamps on the Strand burned through it like coins held under water. Hackney coaches rattled past with their wheels striking sparks from the cobbles. Hawkers cried mackerel and chestnuts at the corners. The whole city smelt of coal smoke and horse and the River Thames, and through it all, in the courtyards of the great houses, ostlers in fawn waistcoats walked matched bays under brass-fitted lamps. Ashcombe House stood in a quiet square off Piccadilly, narrow-fronted and tall, with iron railings black as wet ink. Within an hour of their arrival, Leora began to hear the talk. It came up by way of the scullery girls in the back area. The Duke of Ashcombe was finished. He had grown queer up in the north. He had let his estates run to seed. There were those at court who said the poison had reached his wits at last, and that the regent's friends were already speaking of his seat in the Lords. A duke who would not dine in society was no use to anyone, and a duke who brought a kitchen maid to town was a man past saving. Leora carried that knowledge upstairs with her and said nothing. On the third evening in London, Cedric was bid to a banquet at the house of Lord Carnaby in Mayfair. 300 candles, a string quartet, the cream of the Tory benches and their wives. Before he stepped into the carriage, he drew Leora aside in the hall. "You will come with my party as a serving girl," he said quietly. "When I send for tea, it is to be brewed by your hand alone, no leaf from any pot but the one you carry from the carriage. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Speak of this to no one." In Lord Carnaby's gilded supper-room, she watched him through the press of liveried footmen. He drank no wine. He left his soup untouched. His right hand, resting upon the cloth, trembled in a small, steady way no one but she would have noticed. When the cards were called for in the drawing-room, he sent his manservant down for tea. Leora brewed it in the still room off the kitchens from the tin she had carried in her apron pocket. Pico, with a thread of dried orange peel and a pinch of something from her grandmother's bundle, ground fine. She walked it up herself. The Duke took the cup without looking at her and drank it, standing by the window. Within 5 minutes, his hand was still. She slipped into the back passage for fresh hot water and lost her way among the side corridors. A door stood ajar at the end of one of them, releasing a thin line of candlelight and the murmur of 2 voices in low conference. She knew the first at once, Dr. Malvern. The second was a heavier, more polished voice, the voice of a man accustomed to royal anterooms. Sir Alistair Pembroke, the footman had whispered to her that morning in the carriage, pointing out a stout figure in a garter star. Physician in ordinary to Her Majesty. "Progress beyond anything I should have judged possible," Malvern was saying. "He took no tincture this morning. He laughed at table yesterday, Sir Alistair. Laughed." "And the source of the change?" "A kitchen girl, from the moors. She cooks for him alone." A pause. "Then the girl must not interfere further. See to it before we leave town." Leora drew back into the dark and stood very still until their footsteps had passed in the opposite direction. She did not run. She walked back through the kitchens, found the hot water, carried up another pot of tea, and stood through the rest of the evening with her eyes lowered as a serving girl ought. It was past midnight when the carriages returned them to the inn at which the lesser staff had been lodged, a low-beamed house in Holborn called the Saracen's Head. Leora climbed to her attic room with a candle in her hand. Her trunk had been opened. Her shifts and her stockings and her grandmother's recipe book lay scattered across the floorboards. A silver thimble her mother had given her, of no great value, lay untouched on the bed. She knelt and went through every page of the book twice. A single page was gone, the one her grandmother had marked in faded ink with a black sun. They were on the road north within 3 days. Cedric gave the order at breakfast, without explanation, in a voice that allowed no question. The wagons rolled out of Piccadilly under a grey sky thick with coal smoke, and by the time they reached Hatfield, the first snow of the new year had begun to fall. Leora rode the journey in silence. She had told no one about the page that had been taken from her, nor about the voices in the dark passage at Lord Carnaby's. She kept the half-burnt receipt in a square of linen at her breast and turned the matter over for 5 days on the road. The Duke had ridden the whole way north with Dr. Malvern's leather case of compounds locked at his feet. The physician traveled in the third carriage now, and at every inn, Cedric took his rooms on a different floor. They reached Blackthorn 4 days before Candlemas. The man who climbed down into the gravel courtyard was not the man who had set out. He gave Hargrove his hat and gloves and asked, in a low voice, after the welfare of the stable boy who had taken a chill in November. The old butler stood quite still for a moment, then bowed and said the boy was mended. On the second morning home, Leora was summoned to the library before breakfast. The Duke stood at the long window. He did not turn. "From this day, Bennet, you will prepare every dish that comes to my table, every cup of tea, every glass of cordial. The contents of the still room are to come under your charge. Do you accept this?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Speak of the matter to no one, Mrs. Whitmore included." "Yes, Your Grace." He turned then. His face was thinner than it had been a fortnight ago, and there was a hollow about his eyes she had not seen before. But he watched her, as a living man watches another living person, and that was something quite new. "Thank you," he said. She nearly dropped her tray. Dr. Malvern came twice to the manor in the following week and was sent away each time with the message that His Grace was at his correspondence. Half the bottles in the still room were emptied into the kitchen midden under cover of darkness. The rest Leora locked in a flour bin and gave the key to Hargrove. The headaches that had bent the Duke over his desk 3 afternoons in the week did not return. Other changes followed. He rode out across the moors on a black mare for the first time in years, the dogs running ahead of him on the white turf, and came back with the color up in his cheeks. He sat through 3 meetings with his land steward and granted relief on the rents of 2 farms that had taken bad harvests. The drawing-room piano, which had stood under a dust cover since the late Duchess's day, was uncovered and tuned. He did not play it. He stood beside it for a long while one evening, and only laid his hand upon the wood. On the 11th night after their return, a storm came down out of Scotland and broke against the moors with thunder and a wind that rattled every shutter in the house. Leora was carrying a covered tray of broth up the east staircase when she saw a band of yellow light beneath a door that should have been locked. The eastern library was the Duke's private room. She had never seen it open. Mrs. Whitmore had told her, on her second day, that no one but His Grace held the key. The door was ajar. Cedric sat at the long table at the center of the room, with his coat off and a fire burning low behind him. Spread across the table were letters tied in faded ribbon, parchment weighted with stones, ledgers in old hands, and a thick pile of Hansard reports from the parliamentary session of 1808. He looked up. He did not seem surprised to see her. "Come in," he said. "Close the door." She did. "You will have wondered why I sent for you to London." "Yes, Your Grace." "And why no man in this house could be trusted with my tea." "Yes, Your Grace." He looked at the rain running on the dark window. "There was a supper at Carlton House in the summer of 1808. I was 28. I had spoken against a small bill favoured by certain gentlemen close to the Crown, a matter of West Indies trade. I gave it no further thought when I sat down to dine that evening. I left the table at midnight and was carried into the hall on the arms of 2 footmen. The physicians said it was an apoplexy. They said I would not live until morning." "And you lived?" "After a fashion." He met her eyes. "I rose from that bed 3 weeks later, able to walk and speak and ride. But I could no longer taste my dinner. Music which I had loved as a younger man, became as the scraping of iron. The company of others tired me beyond bearing. I felt no grief at my mother's death the following winter, no joy at my sister's marriage. Whatever the poison had taken from me, it did not give back. He drew a slow breath. For 4 years I believed myself cursed. I came to consider myself a dead man walking through the rooms of his own house. He looked down at the papers. Then a thief broke into my kitchen. She could not speak. He turned a sheet of paper toward her with one finger, a letter to his late father, dated April of 1809, from a Lord Westbury of Northamptonshire. She read it standing. Lord Westbury, an aging peer of advanced Whig opinions, had spoken at length in the Lords against a Crown appointment. 6 months later, he had been taken with a strange, wasting illness. He had lost his appetite, his temper, his interest in his own affairs. He had died, the letter said, more shadow than man, and out of his mind by the end. "There are 9 more," Cedric said quietly. "I have been a month gathering them. 9 peers in 12 years who set themselves across the wishes of a small circle in Westminster. 5 of us have lived. Of those 5, 4 have ceased to attend Parliament. Of the 4, 3 have given up their estates to managers and taken to their beds." He looked up. "It is not an illness, Bennett. It is a method." The invitation came at the close of January in a stiff cream envelope sealed with the Thornfield crest. A winter ball, to be held by the Marquess and Marchioness of Thornfield at their seat near Bakewell, in honor of the Marquess's youngest daughter coming of age. The Regent's brother was to attend on the second evening. Cedric burned the answering refusal in the fire and wrote an acceptance in his own hand. "If they would see me a madman," he told Hargrove, "let them see me dance." Mrs. Whitmore came to Leora's chamber that same afternoon with a covered basket on her arm. "His Grace has asked that you attend him at Thornfield as part of the upper staff," she said, without looking at her. "Not in the kitchens, at table. You will sit behind his chair with his manservant, and you will eat what the household staff eat. I will not have you go in a serge gown." She set the basket down and lifted out a folded length of fine lavender wool, an apron of plain cream linen, a pair of gray kid gloves, and a small lace cap. "Mind the hem when you walk." "Yes, ma'am." "And Bennett," the housekeeper paused at the door, her hand on the latch. "I should not be sorry if His Grace returned with you alive. Mind that also." They reached Thornfield on the afternoon of the 3rd day, the carriages winding up through a park of bare beech trees with the great house set high on a terrace of pale stone, every window already lit. Footmen in green livery handed down the guests. Inside, the long entrance hall had been hung with hothouse white roses and laurel branches. The ball began at 9. The ballroom was vast. 3 high chandeliers, each holding 80 wax candles, throwing trembling light upon a polished oak floor. A string quartet from York played country dances in one corner. Silk gowns moved past in lemon and pale rose and ivory. Officers of the 10th Hussars stood along the wall in scarlet jackets and gold lace. Cedric danced once with his hostess, civilly, and then took his place along the wall. Leora kept her station 3 paces behind the Ashcombe party. The lavender gown sat strangely upon her, but Hargrove had schooled her that morning in how to stand and where to look. She watched the room. The fans came out behind her almost at once. She could not catch the whole of what was said, only the parts the ladies meant for her ears. "That is the girl, then. From a fishing village, my dear. They say he means to make her his housekeeper. They say worse." It went on until supper was called at midnight. 40 round tables of 10 had been laid in the long picture gallery, each with its own candelabra. Cedric took his place near the head, between an aged baronet and the Marquess's pretty cousin from Bath. Leora stood at his shoulder with the silver salver for his cards. She saw the movement at the second table from theirs. Sir Alistair Pembroke sat there, in a black coat and a garter star, leaning to murmur into the ear of his neighbor. As he spoke, his right hand passed beneath the cloth and re-emerged a moment later with a small glass vial held against the heel of his palm. 2 drops fell into a wine glass standing untouched on the corner of his table. The footman lifted that glass an instant later and bore it away upon a tray. Leora's eyes followed it. It traveled the length of the gallery between the seated guests and was set down upon the cloth at the Duke's elbow. The footman bowed and stepped back. Cedric did not see. He was speaking to the Marquess's cousin about a horse he had bought from her father in 2006. His right hand rested upon the stem of the glass. Leora took 1 step forward. She leaned, as a serving girl will, to lay a clean napkin at his place. With her other hand, low and unhurried, she lifted the prepared glass and set down, in its stead, the glass of the elderly bishop seated upon Cedric's far side. The bishop had been arguing with a deaf countess for 10 minutes and had touched nothing on his table. The exchange was done before her gloved hand had drawn back. Cedric raised his glass and drank. Across him, the bishop reached for his own, lifted it, sipped, set it down. He frowned. He sipped again. He had not finished a 3rd sip when his face went the color of wet chalk. His hand opened. The glass fell upon the cloth. His eyes rolled back to the white, and he pitched forward without a cry, his forehead striking the silver candelabra and the candles going down in a soft hiss. A woman screamed down the gallery. Footmen ran. Sir Alistair Pembroke was upon his feet with a physician's calm before any other man in the room had risen. He bent over the bishop with 2 of his own people, snapped an order at a startled footman, and within a quarter of an hour the body had been carried out through the servants' passage, and a notice of weak heart was being passed quietly from table to table. The Marquess looked relieved. The music in the next room had not stopped. Cedric had set down his glass. He did not finish his supper. He did not speak until they had returned to their rooms at 2 in the morning, and then only 1 sentence as he stood with his back to the fire and his hands behind him. "It was never finished, was it?" he said. Leora shook her head. "They have been keeping me at it for 4 years." They left Thornfield at first light. Cedric had paid off the Marquess's steward with a story of urgent business in York. The family carriage rolled south at a reasonable pace until it was out of sight of the great house. Then, at a crossroads above Matlock, the Duke ordered the driver to turn the horses west. He had brought only Hargrove, a single groom sworn to silence, Leora, and the saddlebags of papers from his Eastern library. They went under other names through Manchester, Preston, and Lancaster, lodging at small inns and paying in coin. Cedric wore the plain black coat of a country physician. Leora kept to a brown stuff gown beneath an old grey cloak. The half-burnt receipt from her grandmother's book had borne, beneath the cordial of nettle and rowan, 3 small words in another hand: Sisters at Carncross. Hargrove knew the place. There had been an old foundation of nuns on the moors above Coldbeck that had served as a refuge for retired upper servants of noble houses since before the old king's reign. Discreet women, learned in the still room. He had been sent there once as a young footman with a letter. They came up to it on the 5th day in a fall of fine snow. Carncross Abbey was a low grey building of weathered stone, half timber and half ruin, set against a fell that climbed away into the cloud. Smoke rose from one chimney. A wooden gate stood open in the high wall, and within the courtyard a single black goat chewed at a bundle of straw. The sister who answered the bell was old and small and bright-eyed, with red knuckles and a kind, unsurprised face. "You will be the gentleman who wrote," she said to Cedric, though no letter had been sent. "Come in. Mother Agnes is by the parlor fire." Mother Agnes was older still, perhaps 80, sitting upright in a high oak chair with a thick black shawl about her shoulders and a small leather book of psalms upon her lap. She looked at Cedric for a long moment, and then at Leora, and the book closed in her hands. "You are Catherine Ashcombe's son," she said. "I am, ma'am." "Sit down, child. Let me see the page." Leora took the burnt receipt from her bodice and laid it open on the table. The old woman's eyes did not glance at the cordial. They went straight to the black sun, ringed by its 7 points. She was quiet for the length of a slow breath. "So it has come north again." Cedric leaned forward. "You know this sign?" "I have known it 60 years. It was old then." She passed her thumb along the edge of the burnt page. "Sit. I shall tell you what I may, and you will not love the telling." In the reign of the old king, she said, a small society had formed among the physicians who attended the great houses of London, not above 12 men at any time. They called themselves a guild of natural philosophers, but their study was of one thing only, the parts of a man that may be put to sleep without killing the man, the taste of his food, the pleasure of his music, the grief he feels at a death, the love he feels for a wife. They began with herbs. They moved on in time to alchemical compounds brought back from the India trade, and they discovered that a lord who took no joy in life took no part in life. He did not contest a bill, did not press a suit, gave his vote where his physician advised, and his physician was advised by other men. "The black sun is the mark they leave upon their writings," she said. 7 points for 7 of the chief drugs in the compound. Cedric sat very still. "My mother." "Your mother came to this house in the spring of the year you were 18. She had found a letter among your father's papers and had begun to gather names. She came here for counsel from one who had been waiting woman to the old Marchioness of Westbury, who lost her wits in the same way. Your mother left this house on a Tuesday morning. She was dead of fever within the month." Leora put her hand to her mouth. "Now hear the rest," said the old nun, and she turned her bright eyes on her. "Where did you grow up, child?" "In Whitby, ma'am." "And your grandmother, what was her family name?" "Hartshorn, ma'am." Mother Agnes nodded slowly. "It is as I thought." There were 5 families in the north of England who held the receipts for the counter-compounds, old women, mostly, who had served apothecaries' households. Hartshorn was one of them. Your grandmother's cordials were not for sweet eating. They were physic against the black sun. You have been giving him medicine these 3 months and did not know it. "But how?" "It is a knowledge that passes through hands. You learned it from her as she learned it from hers." Cedric had risen to his feet. He was about to speak when, from the courtyard, the abbey bell began to ring. The small sister came back in, white about the mouth. "Mother, there are 6 riders at the gate, armed. They say they are king's men, come for a fugitive duke." Mother Agnes did not blink. "Go out by the still room. There is a path through the fell side to a shepherd's hut. Take the page. Take this." She pressed a sealed packet into Cedric's hand. "And ride hard. The bells will keep them at the door a quarter of an hour." They were on the snow-covered hill within 5 minutes, Cedric leading the horse by the bridle, Leora half running at his side, and behind them, faintly and clearly, the bells of Carncross rang out across the white fells. They came down out of the fells by the shepherd's tracks and crossed into Westmoreland on a hired pony cart, Hargrove in the box, the groom riding ahead at every turn to scout the road. By the time the moors of Yorkshire showed dark on the horizon, the sealed packet from Mother Agnes sat hidden between the boards of the cart, and Cedric had ceased to speak above a low voice. He smelt the burning before he saw it. A column of dirty smoke hung in the air half a mile out from the estate, the color of old iron. The west wing of Blackthorn stood with 2 of its tall windows broken outwards and the slate of the roof gone above the long drawing room. Soot streaked the white stone of the south face. Stable lads moved among the shrubberies with buckets and brooms. The fire was out, but the air still tasted of wet ash. Hargrove pulled the cart up at the courtyard. Mrs. Whitmore came down the steps, with her cap askew and her eyes red. "Your Grace." "How many lost?" Cedric said before he had set foot to the gravel. "None, sir, praise God. The maids were already out." Tom smelled the smoke from the carriage house. "When?" "2 nights past, sir, near midnight. It began in the linen press above the kitchens. The garden door was found unlocked in the morning. The boy who minded the kitchen fire swears he banked it down himself." Cedric walked into the burnt wing with his coat still on, and Leora a step behind. The long drawing room was a ruin. The great curtains gone, the carpet a wet black mat, the gilt frames warped upon the wall. The bookcases in the small estate office at the end of the corridor stood open and emptied. "The Westbury letter," he said quietly. "The Hansard reports. The notes I made at Christmas." "All gone, sir," said Hargrove behind him. "I checked yesterday." Cedric did not raise his voice. "Where is Dr. Malvern?" There was a small, terrible silence in the corridor. The old housekeeper put her hand against the doorframe. The color was gone out of her face. "Gone, sir, since the morning after the fire. He took his case and his bay mare and rode out at dawn. He left no message." Cedric looked at her. She came forward into the burnt room and went down upon her knees on the wet carpet. "I told him," she said. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I told him you were better. I told him of the supper you ate at Christmas and the morning you rode out to the South Tenants. I told him you no longer took the green vial. He came to me in the still room 3 months ago. He said if I did not write to him each week with news of you, the physicians in London would see to it that every servant in this house was turned out without character before Easter. I have a sister, sir. She is widowed. I have a nephew at school in Ripon I keep on my own wages. I did it for the house. I am very sorry." Cedric stood looking down at her for a long while. When at last he spoke gently. "Get up, Mrs. Whitmore. We will speak of this another day. Have a fire built in the small dining room, and bring what bread you can find. Bennett, see to it." A storm came in off the moors before dusk, the sort of black, low-bellied storm that brings thunder. By 8 o'clock the rain was falling so thickly upon the courtyard that the lamps in the stable yard could not be seen from the kitchen door. Cedric had gone out himself to see to the black mare, who had taken a chill on the journey home. Leora, finishing in the kitchens, went after him with a lantern and a folded blanket beneath her arm. She heard the cry as she came under the arch. It was not the Duke's voice. It was a low, surprised grunt, the kind of sound a man makes when he has been struck before he expected the blow. She set the lantern down upon the cobbles and stepped inside the stables. Cedric was on his knees in the straw beside the standing stall, one hand pressed to the side of his head, and standing over him was a man in a dark coat with a sackcloth pulled across his face. The man held a short cudgel, raised for a second blow. Leora did not call out. A long iron stable hook hung on its peg beside the door, used for lifting bales of straw down from the loft. She took it in both hands. The man heard her step as she came, and he turned half a second too late. She did not aim. She swung as her father had once shown her to swing a gaff at a coming fish, short, heavy, from the shoulder. The hook caught the man across the back of the wrist, and the bone gave with a sound she would hear again in her sleep. He dropped the cudgel. He cursed once and lunged for her, and she swung the hook a second time across the face. The sackcloth tore. She saw a strip of jaw and a fair beard. He went out the rear door of the stables into the rain. She did not chase. Cedric was already on his feet. There was blood at his temple, but his eyes were clear. They stood looking at each other across the straw. "You will go to my sister in Bruges by week's end," he said. "I will not have you killed." "No, Your Grace." "Bennett, No! She set the iron hook against the wall and went to see to his head. The packet from Mother Agnes was opened on the morning after the stables. It held 3 sheets in the old nun's hand, the names of the 12 physicians of the Black Sun, as she had heard them 60 years past, the seal of their compact with a copy of the cipher beneath, and a small drawing of a house in Mayfair, where the records were said to be kept. Cedric read it through twice, and sat for an hour with the papers across his knee. Then he raised his head. "Pembroke must be drawn into the open," he said. "He is a sealed book in private. He will speak only in his own house, and only to one he believes broken." Leora set down the teapot. "Then let him believe it." The letter went out by trusted hand on the 3rd day. Cedric had written it in a wavering script, full of pauses and small confusions of grammar. He spoke of returning headaches and of forgetting the names of his tenants. He confessed himself ashamed of his late conduct at Thornfield, and begged the kind counsel of Sir Alistair, whom he had so misjudged. Would the great physician be so good as to receive him at the royal medical banquet at Buckingham House on the 18th of March? The reply came within 4 days, in a hand of warm and patient sympathy. Of course his Grace must come. A private interview would be arranged. Sir Alistair was sure that with care, much might yet be set right. They went down to London at the end of February. Cedric took rooms in a hired house off Berkeley Square and was rarely seen out of it. Leora kept to a small lodging in St. Martin's Lane with an apothecary by the name of Mr. Edmund Hartwell, who had known the late Duchess's family for 30 years and who closed his shop to all custom for the duration of her stay. Among the papers his late friend had entrusted to him before her death lay copies of 3 letters in Sir Alistair Pembroke's own hand. They named no compounds and no victims, but they spoke in courteous evasions of a private cabinet at the Pembroke House in Mayfair, where matters of the guild were kept. 2 of Hartwell's apprentices, dressed as a coachman and a chimney sweep, were sent up to the kitchens of that house with forged letters of introduction. They came back on the morning of the 18th with 3 pages of cipher copied in pencil upon the inside of a butcher's apron, and a single page from Pembroke's private daybook listing the deliveries of a green tincture to 9 noble households between 1809 and the present. Leora wrapped the pages in oilcloth and carried them under her cloak that night to Buckingham House. The banquet was the grandest she had ever seen. The state apartments blazed with cut-glass chandeliers, each the size of a haycart. 300 guests filled the long picture gallery. Bishops in lawn sleeves, generals with stars upon their breasts, members of the Commons in dark broadcloth, ladies in cream and pale gold. Silver trays of champagne went among them, carried by powdered footmen. At the head of the room stood the Prince Regent's empty chair beneath a canopy of crimson velvet, and beside it, in a black coat and the Garter star, Sir Alistair Pembroke received his guests. Cedric was brought in at 9:30, leaning upon Hargrove's arm. He had eaten nothing all day and had stained his cuffs with weak tea. He looked, to the eye that did not know him, like a sick man failing. "My dear Duke," said Pembroke, "we shall sit you upon my own right hand." They sat. The first course was brought. Cedric let his trembling hand spill a little soup upon the cloth. Pembroke smiled at him in pity. It was between the 3rd course and the 4th that Cedric set down his spoon and rose to his feet. He spoke clearly enough to be heard at the far end of the gallery. "My lords, your eminences, gentlemen of the house, I am charged this evening with a matter that cannot longer wait upon discretion. The gentleman to my right hand, Sir Alistair Pembroke, physician to Her Majesty, has, for 12 years past, conducted with 11 other men a practice of slow poisoning upon the persons of any peer who has spoken against a crown adviser of his choosing." The gallery went still in a single breath. Cedric laid upon the cloth, one by one, the 3 pages of cipher and the page from the daybook, and his voice did not waver as he named the 9 houses. A bishop dropped his glass. Pembroke rose. His face was white. But he had been a courtier 40 years and did not lose it. "This is the raving of a sick man," he said evenly to the room. "I have warned his people for months that his wits were failing. The girl who feeds him, that creature behind his chair, has been giving him compounds of her own devising, which I told him plainly would shorten his life and her own. Look at her, my lords. Look at the color of her face." The eyes of the gallery turned upon Leora. Cedric turned with them. He saw what he had perhaps not let himself see for weeks: the hollowness of her cheek, the thinness of her wrist upon the salver, the grey beneath her eyes. Pembroke watched him see it. "Your kitchen maid has been finishing herself to keep you whole, your grace. She will not last the spring." In the silence that followed, Pembroke turned upon his heel and walked out by the side door behind the dais. By the time the first cry of "Stop him!" rose from the assembly, he was through the antechamber and into the street. Cedric was after him before any other man at the table had risen. The rain was coming down in sheets across the mall. Cedric ran with his coat unbuttoned and his hat lost, Hargrove behind him shouting for the Bow Street officers who had been stationed in plain coats at every gate, on the orders of a friend of his late father's in the magistracy. The chase went down through the wet streets toward the river. Pembroke turned at last into the lanes about the Adelphi and made for the Thames. They caught him on the steps of the wharf at Hungerford, where a hired boatman was even then putting out his sculls. 2 Bow Street officers took him by either arm. The leather case under his coat fell upon the stones and burst open. The wind off the river lifted the loose papers and carried half of them into the dark water before any man could catch them. The cipher and the daybook lay open on the wet cobbles. It was enough. Within 3 days the doors of the Black Sun had begun to shut, one upon another, all across London. The spring was late in coming to Yorkshire that year. For 3 weeks after the Duke and his household returned from London, the moors held under their last covering of snow, and the becks ran black with meltwater. Then, one morning at the end of March, a soft south wind came up from the vale, and within a week the snowdrops were thick under the beeches, and the first pale buds had opened on the wych elm beside the lodge. By April, Blackthorn was a different house. The shutters of the west wing had been taken down, and the carpenters were at work upon the burnt rafters. The drawing-room piano, which had stood untouched since Christmas, was played almost every evening, sometimes by Mrs. Whitmore's niece, who was visiting from Halifax, sometimes by the Duke himself. He played indifferently and with much pleasure. The maids on the back stairs no longer dropped their voices when they passed the door of the great hall. The news from London came in slowly across the winter. Of the 12 names upon Mother Agnes's sheet, 4 had fled to the continent before any process could be laid against them. 3 had been quietly retired from their court appointments without public charge. 2 had taken their own lives in the fortnight after Pembroke's capture. Sir Alistair himself sat in Newgate Jail, awaiting the hearing the Crown's lawyers were already laboring to delay. A pamphlet had appeared in February, setting out the affair under a thin veil of fictional names, and had been suppressed within a week, though copies, Hargrove said, were passing through the coffee houses of the Strand for a guinea apiece. Dr. Malvern had been found in early March at a small port in Holland, dead by his own hand. Cedric read each piece of news without satisfaction. He had not gone south for satisfaction. His own recovery came as the weather came, by slow degrees, with relapses. He could taste salt now, and the warmth of meat, and the sharpness of vinegar. He could not taste honey, or fresh cream, or the milder fruits of the kitchen garden. There were mornings still when his head ached for an hour after waking, and the corners of the bedroom were grey to his eye. The physicians from York, whom he had consulted in February, had told him plainly that some part of the damage would not return. He had thanked them and given them their fee, and not asked again. It was Leora's health that troubled him. She was thinner than she had been in November, and her hands were cold even in the warm kitchens. Mr. Hartwell had come up from London in February and lodged 3 weeks at the manor, and between him and an old woman from Coldbeck, whom Mother Agnes had sent down, a course of slow physic had been begun for her. Beef broth, milk, the early nettle tops, an iron tincture in small doses. She slept long. She had been ordered out of the kitchens until midsummer, and Mrs. Whitmore had taken over her duties with a kind of grim, atoning devotion. She walked in the gardens each afternoon when the weather allowed. Cedric walked with her. The first Sunday in May, the village of Ashcombe Magna held its spring fair on the great lawn before the manor. There had been no such fair at Blackthorn in 9 years. Long, white tents were raised upon the cropped grass. 2 fiddlers and a flute player from Skipton had been hired to play reels under the chestnut trees. The cooks of the village set out trestles of currant cake and seed cake and tea. Mothers with babies sat upon the low stone wall under the cedar. The vicar's children chased a black and white dog round the rose arches and were laughed at by their father. Leora walked out into it on Cedric's arm in a gown of plain, pale grey muslin, her hair done up under a fresh, white cap. She had been 3 days out of her bed. They came to a stop beneath the great arch of the dog rose at the head of the south walk. The petals were not yet open. The whole arch was a green shape of small buds. Cedric looked at the lawn for a while. Then he looked at her. "Before you broke into my kitchen," he said, "I believed my life already finished. I did not say so to anyone. I had not the words for it. But I should be a coward not to say so now." Leora was quiet a moment. Then she reached into the small basket Mrs. Whitmore had pressed upon her at the door, took out a folded napkin, and unwrapped a slice of blackberry tart still warm from the oven. "You have not eaten today, Your Grace." "I have not." "Then open your mouth." He laughed. The sound surprised him. It surprised her also, for she had not heard him laugh out loud before. He opened his mouth. She fed him a spoonful of the tart. He held it on his tongue for a long moment. The soft pastry, the dark juice of the fruit, a whisper of sugar he had not tasted since he was a young man at Cambridge. "Well," she said, "it is very good." "That is all?" "It is very good, Bennet. And I am not, I think, finished after all." From the far side of the lawn, where the fiddlers had struck up a country dance and the children had taken hands in a long, crooked ring, the church bells of Ashcombe Magna began to ring across the warm fields for the spring. Cedric did not let go of her arm. Neither of them moved from beneath the rose arch for a long while.